In the winter of 1942, on a narrow street in occupied Paris, the sound of a sewing machine drifted through a second-floor window. It was a harmless sound, familiar and unthreatening, the steady rhythm of needles striking fabric, thread pulled tight, cloth folded with care. German soldiers passed beneath that window without slowing their step. They had heard that sound all across the city. It meant nothing. It meant routine. It meant a woman earning her living under occupation. Behind the wardrobe, concealed by a false wooden panel, a radio transmitter waited in silence. At precisely 9:43 in the evening, the woman at the sewing table paused. She did not look toward the door or the window. She did not rush. She finished the seam she was working on, clipped the thread and folded the garment with deliberate calm. Only then did she stand, cross the room and slide the wardrobe aside by a fraction of an inch. Her hands moved with the same confidence she used when cutting cloth. The panel opened. The radio came alive. Outside, the curfew bell echoed through Paris. Inside that room, history was about to change course. This is not the story of a general studying maps or a pilot gripping a control column at altitude. It is not the story of tanks rolling across borders or warships exchanging fire at sea. It is the story of a woman whose profession made her invisible, whose courage made her indispensable, and whose voice, carried across the air by fragile radio waves, delivered secrets powerful enough to cripple an occupying enemy. In 1940, France had fallen with shocking speed. The German army entered Paris on June 14, banners unfurled, boots echoing on the cobblestones of a defeated capital. Within weeks, the country was divided, occupied zones controlled directly by the Wehrmacht, and a collaborationist regime installed in Vichy. The machinery of occupation tightened quickly. Food was rationed. Movement was restricted. Radios were confiscated. The penalty for illegal transmission was immediate arrest, torture, and often execution. Yet even as the enemy consolidated control, resistance began to grow in the shadows. Across France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Poland, ordinary citizens made extraordinary choices. Teachers became couriers. Farmers became saboteurs. Clerks memorized train schedules and patrol patterns. And women, dismissed by occupying forces as harmless or inconsequential, became the backbone of clandestine networks that fed intelligence directly to the Allies. Among the most dangerous of these roles was that of the wireless operator. Radio operators were lifelines. They connected occupied Europe to London. They transmitted information about troop movements, rail traffic, fuel depots, coastal defenses, and planned offensives. Without them, resistance cells were blind and isolated. With them, Allied command gained eyes and ears deep behind enemy lines. They were also hunted relentlessly. German counterintelligence units, particularly the Gestapo and the Abwehr, deployed mobile direction-finding teams equipped with vans carrying rotating antennas. By triangulating radio signals, they could locate an illegal transmitter in minutes. Once a signal was detected, the race began. Operators were trained to transmit for no longer than 20 minutes at a time. Many limited themselves to 10. Every second longer increased the risk of capture. For women operating these radios, the danger was constant and absolute. The woman at the sewing table had not been born a spy. Before the war, she had learned her trade as an apprentice in a dressmaking shop near Montmartre. She measured hems, altered sleeves, and listened to customers talk about fashions, marriages, and small domestic concerns. When the occupation came, her work continued. Clothing was still needed. Uniforms needed mending. Civilian dresses were altered again and again as fabric grew scarce. Her profession saved her. A seamstress was expected to work at home. Visitors came and went. Needles, wires, and metal frames were normal tools of the trade. When she was recruited by a resistance contact in late 1941, it was precisely this ordinariness that made her valuable. She could conceal components inside dress forms. She could hide coded messages inside hems. And she could operate a radio in a room that no one thought to question. Her training was brief and brutal. She learned Morse code until the dots and dashes replaced language itself. She learned encryption systems provided by the British Special Operations Executive, memorizing pages of cipher tables that would be burned after use. She learned how to assemble and disassemble a transmitter in minutes, how to ground the antenna to avoid detection, how to destroy equipment if the door was kicked in. Most importantly, she learned discipline. Never transmit twice from the same location in a single day. Never write down addresses. Never ask for names. Never hesitate if captured, because hesitation would be interpreted as guilt. She was told, with chilling clarity, that her average life expectancy in the field would be measured in months. She accepted anyway. By early 1942, her radio was active. Messages flowed to London under code names that meant nothing to anyone but the network controllers on the other end. She transmitted at night, when the streets were quiet and the risk of interruption was lower. She sent reports about German troop trains moving east. She sent information about new anti-aircraft batteries along the coast. She sent warnings of impending arrests, sometimes hours before the Gestapo arrived. Each transmission was a gamble. The German radio hunters were improving. They learned patterns. They adapted. Vans rolled through neighborhoods slowly, antennas spinning, operators listening for the faintest irregularity in the electromagnetic noise of the city. Entire resistance cells vanished after a single mistake. Operators were beaten, interrogated, and forced to transmit under duress, sending false messages designed to lure others into traps. The seamstress knew this. She heard the stories whispered in safe houses and back rooms. She knew the fate that awaited her if she failed. Still, she returned to the radio. Because the information mattered. In London, analysts plotted her reports on maps. Timetables were adjusted. Bomber routes were changed. Sabotage teams were dispatched to rail lines she identified. The enemy felt the disruption but could not yet see the source. Supplies arrived late. Units moved without explanation. Orders were countered by events no one could predict. The signals from that small room were beginning to have an effect. But the war was tightening its grip. In 1943, German counterintelligence intensified operations against resistance networks. Arrests increased. Safe houses were compromised. The margin for error shrank to nothing. For every successful transmission, the risk doubled. The seamstress began to change locations more frequently, carrying components hidden among bolts of fabric, assembling the radio anew in borrowed rooms. Each knock at the door carried weight. Yet she continued because stopping meant silence, and silence meant blindness for those preparing the next phase of the war. Allied planners were already looking ahead. The invasion of Western Europe was no longer a question of if, but when. And when that day came, success would depend on knowledge gathered by people like her. In a room that smelled of fabric and oil, beneath the hum of a sewing machine, the enemy's secrets were being stripped away, one transmission at a time. This is the story of how a woman, a radio, and the signals she sent helped cripple an occupying power from within. It is a story of patience, fear, and extraordinary resolve. And it is only the beginning. By the spring of 1943, the war beneath the streets of occupied Europe had become as dangerous and complex as any fought on open battlefields. The seamstress was no longer an isolated operator. She was a node in a widening, fragile web of resistance networks stretching from Paris to Lyon, from the Channel coast to the forests of central France. Each message she sent was part of a larger mosaic of intelligence, assembled piece by Allied planners who depended on accuracy, timing, and absolute secrecy. The radio she used was compact but temperamental. Built from British-supplied components dropped by parachute under cover of darkness, it required careful tuning and constant maintenance. Vacuum tubes overheated. Power supplies failed. Antennas had to be improvised from lengths of wire strung along rooftops, attics, or hidden within stairwells. Every transmission required preparation, patience, and nerve. Her routine was rigid. She selected transmission sites hours in advance, never using the same location twice in succession. Apartments belonging to sympathizers, abandoned workshops, back rooms of shops shuttered by rationing, each offered temporary shelter. She carried the radio in pieces, concealed among sewing tools and folded fabric. If stopped at a checkpoint, she was a working woman moving between clients. Nothing more. Yet the danger followed her everywhere. German counterintelligence had refined its methods. Direction-finding vans operated in coordinated teams, sweeping neighborhoods with mathematical precision. Operators inside listened through headphones, watching needles twitch as signals appeared. When a transmission was detected, the vans closed in, narrowing the radius with each adjustment. Once the source was pinpointed, arrests followed swiftly and without mercy. The seamstress knew the rules. She transmitted in bursts no longer than 10 minutes. Often less. She sat motionless while sending, counting seconds in her head, listening for footsteps in stairwells, engines outside, a sudden knock that would end everything. At the first sign of danger, the radio could be dismantled in under 2 minutes. If escape was impossible, a small vial of acid was kept within reach to destroy codebooks and frequency crystals. Her messages were precise. She reported troop movements observed from train stations, where women gathered without suspicion. She relayed schedules learned from overheard conversations in shops and cafes frequented by German personnel. She transmitted details of new coastal defenses, concrete emplacements, artillery calibers, angles of fire, information gathered by resistance scouts risking their lives along the Atlantic Wall. In London, these reports were not treated lightly. At headquarters of the Special Operations Executive, analysts cross-checked transmissions against aerial reconnaissance and other sources. When patterns emerged, action followed. Rail lines identified by resistance radio operators were targeted by sabotage teams. Supply convoys were ambushed. Air raids were redirected to strike fuel depots and repair facilities previously unknown to Allied intelligence. The enemy noticed the effects but struggled to understand the cause. German units arrived late to the front. Ammunition stocks dwindled unexpectedly. Coastal defenses were struck with uncanny accuracy. Commanders blamed bad luck, partisan activity, or Allied air superiority, rarely suspecting that the most damaging information was coming from ordinary rooms in ordinary buildings, transmitted by women they did not consider threats. But the pressure increased. In mid-1943, a major resistance network in Paris was compromised after a courier was captured. Under torture, addresses were revealed. Arrests followed in waves. Radios fell silent. Entire cells vanished overnight. The seamstress learned of the collapse through coded warnings sent by another operator shortly before her own transmitter went dark. She burned her papers that night. For weeks, she ceased transmissions entirely, living under assumed identities, moving constantly. This silence was not failure, it was survival. SOE doctrine emphasized one truth above all others. A living operator was more valuable than a dead one. When conditions stabilized, when new safe routes were established, she returned to the airwaves. By late 1943, the strategic importance of resistance intelligence had grown exponentially. Allied commanders were preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in history. Every detail mattered. Beach gradients, road junctions, German reserve locations, communication nodes. The success of the invasion would depend not only on armies and fleets, but on the accuracy of information gathered months in advance by unseen operatives behind enemy lines. The seamstress became part of this effort. Her transmissions shifted focus. She reported construction along the Normandy coast. She sent updates on troop concentrations moving toward northern France. She warned of German exercises simulating coastal defense. Each message was encrypted, transmitted, received, decrypted, and plotted by planners who understood that lives would depend on its reliability. The risk to her increased accordingly. German radio hunters intensified patrols near coastal regions. New detection equipment reduced the time needed to locate a signal. Operators were advised to transmit for no more than 5 minutes. Some lasted only seconds. The seamstress adapted, compressing messages, relying on prearranged codes that conveyed entire paragraphs with a handful of signals. She aged visibly during those months. Sleep came in fragments. Trust was rationed. Every stranger was a potential informant. Yet she continued, driven by a conviction shared by many in the resistance, that endurance itself was a form of defiance. In early June 1944, the volume of transmissions surged. Warnings poured in from across France. German units were on alert. Roadblocks appeared. Trains were halted. Resistance networks prepared for coordinated sabotage. The seamstress transmitted continuously for days, moving from location to location, relaying updates as the invasion drew near. On the night of June 5, she sent one final message before dismantling her radio. The invasion was imminent. By dawn, Allied forces were landing on the beaches of Normandy. Behind enemy lines, resistance fighters struck railways, bridges, and communication lines, delaying German reinforcements at critical moments. The intelligence gathered and transmitted by operators like the seamstress played a quiet but decisive role in those hours. The enemy reeled. Yet the danger did not end with the landings. German counterintelligence responded with brutal efficiency. Reprisals followed. Arrests resumed. The seamstress went to ground once more, this time for weeks, as the front lines shifted and liberation advanced unevenly across France. Her war was nearing its end, but the cost was already clear. Many operators did not survive to see liberation. Some were executed. Others disappeared into camps. Their contributions were classified, their names omitted from public records for years after the war. Victory would be celebrated by generals and politicians, while the quiet war waged from back rooms and attics faded into obscurity. As Allied armies pushed eastward, the seamstress transmitted less frequently. The need for clandestine intelligence diminished as territory was reclaimed. When Paris was liberated in August 1944, she dismantled her radio for the final time. She returned to her sewing table. But nothing was the same. The war she had fought left no medals on her chest, no photographs in newspapers. It left memories, scars, and the knowledge that the smallest signals, sent by the most unassuming hands, had helped alter the course of history. The full measure of that impact would only become clear with time. When the guns finally fell silent in Western Europe, the war did not end cleanly for those who had fought it from the shadows. Liberation arrived with celebration in the streets, but for the women and men of the resistance, victory was quiet, disorienting, and often incomplete. Files were sealed. Networks dissolved. Radios that had once crackled with urgency were dismantled and hidden away, their components scattered or destroyed. For the seamstress, the end came without ceremony. Paris was liberated in August 1944, its streets flooded with crowds, flags, and relief that bordered on disbelief. German patrols vanished almost overnight. Checkpoints were abandoned. Curfews lifted. For the first time in years, people spoke freely, loudly, without fear of who might be listening. The city exhaled. She watched it happen from the doorway of her building. The sewing machine was still there. The same table. The same tools. Yet the room felt unfamiliar, stripped of the constant tension that had defined her life for so long. The radio, already taken apart and hidden, would never be reassembled. Its purpose had been fulfilled. In London, the effects of the resistance's work were being measured. Post-operation analyses confirmed what planners had long suspected. Intelligence transmitted from occupied Europe had significantly delayed German reinforcements during the Normandy landings. Rail sabotage coordinated through clandestine radio networks had immobilized divisions at critical moments. Coastal defenses identified months in advance had been neutralized with precision. The invasion succeeded not only because of overwhelming force, but because the enemy was deprived of time, coordination, and surprise. Those results were not abstract. They were counted in lives saved on the beaches, in units that avoided ambush, in aircrews that returned because targets had been accurately identified. The signals sent from small rooms, attics, and back workshops had shaped the battlefield long before the first Allied soldiers set foot on French soil. Yet recognition was slow and uneven. Many resistance operatives returned to civilian life without acknowledgement. Their actions remained classified for decades, bound by secrecy laws and political caution. Some were awarded medals quietly. Others received nothing at all. A significant number never returned, their names recorded only in fragmented archives or remembered by those who survived them. The seamstress was among those who faded back into anonymity. She resumed her work, altering clothes for customers who never knew what had once been hidden behind the wardrobe. She married. She aged. The war became something spoken of in anniversaries and official speeches, while her own memories remained private, sharpened by loss and tempered by time. But history does not forget entirely. As archives opened and records were declassified in the decades that followed, the scale of women's contributions to resistance and intelligence operations became impossible to ignore. They had served as couriers, saboteurs, analysts, and radio operators. They had endured arrest, torture, and execution with the same resolve as any soldier. And they had done so while being systematically underestimated by an occupying power that failed to understand the danger of invisibility. The seamstress's story represents thousands of others. Women whose professions made them unseen. Whose homes became operational centers. Whose voices traveled across borders through fragile equipment assembled by hand. They fought a war without uniforms, ranks, or public recognition, bound only by discipline and belief in an outcome they might never live to see. Their legacy is measured not in monuments but in outcomes. The collapse of German logistics in the months following D-Day. The accelerated liberation of occupied territories. The shortening of a war that had already claimed millions of lives. Each was influenced, in part, by information gathered and transmitted at immense personal risk. In modern histories of the Second World War, attention often gravitates toward the visible instruments of conflict. Aircraft, armor, armies in motion. Yet beneath those forces lay an invisible struggle for information, and within that struggle, women like the seamstress played decisive roles. She never fired a weapon. She never commanded troops. But she altered the course of events by ensuring that truth reached those who needed it most. The story of a seamstress and a radio is not a footnote. It is a reminder that war is shaped as much by courage in silence as by force in battle. That resistance can take the form of patience, precision, and the refusal to surrender one's humanity under occupation. Today, when we speak of victory, it is worth remembering those who made it possible without ever stepping into the spotlight. The women whose lives balanced constantly between normalcy and catastrophe. Whose ordinary skills became extraordinary tools. Their war ended quietly. Their impact did not. If you found this story meaningful, consider sharing it, subscribing for more historical documentaries, and leaving a comment to honor those whose courage was once hidden, but never insignificant. In recent years, historians have begun to restore these stories to their rightful place. Diaries, decoded transmissions, and testimony from surviving intelligence officers confirm what was once only suspected, that the success of Allied operations depended heavily on people who would never appear in victory parades. The seamstress and those like her operated without certainty of survival, without assurance that their efforts would matter, and without expectation of recognition. Their strength lay not only in bravery but in restraint. They lived daily lives under occupation, exchanged pleasantries with the enemy, endured suspicion from neighbors and carried fear in silence. Each transmission required a deliberate choice to risk everything again. Each decision to continue was an act of quiet resistance against a system built on intimidation and control. When we remember the Second World War, these stories challenge us to look beyond the battlefield. They remind us that power does not always announce itself with noise or force. Sometimes it travels unseen, hidden in ordinary rooms, carried by ordinary people who choose, again and again, not to surrender.